In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to knit a short row wedge in this piece of garter stitch. I'm going to knit it in a contrast colour so it shows up more clearly, and I'm going to be using the German double stitch method of short row knitting. So I start with placing my new colour into the first stitch. I'm going to do 8 stitches in each short row. So I'm going to knit 8 stitches. Two, 4, 6, 7, 8. So I now want to turn the knitting around and go back in the other direction. So I'm going to turn the knitting. If I just started knitting here again, I would get a little hole at this point. So to avoid that, I'm going to use the German double stitch, which means that I'm going to slip the first stitch from the left needle to the right needle purlwise with the yarn at the front, and then pull the yarn over the top and knit back to the end of the row. I'm also making a chain salvage, so I'm just going to finish my row with a chain salvage. In this wedge I want to do 8 extra stitches each time I knit my short rows, so I'm going to knit the next short row. I've knitted up to the double stitch, so I had a light blue stitch. Let's just go back one stitch. Right. I had a light blue stitch, then the double stitch, and then the dark blue stitches. So I knit up to the double stitch, and then I'm going to knit this as a single stitch. It's not 2 stitches. It's important to make sure that you get through the centre of the stitch with both legs there. Knit. So that is knitting the double stitch, and I'm now going to knit another 8 stitches. Turn the knitting. Make my double stitch. So slip the first stitch purlwise to the right needle, pull the yarn across the top and knit back to the end of the row. Turn the knitting again. So I've now got 4 rows at this end where I haven't got any additional rows at the opposite end of my piece of knitting. I'm going to make one more longer row, and this time I want 24 stitches in the row. So I'm coming up to my double stitch. So this was the double stitch made in the last short row. I knit that as my 16 stitches, and now I need another 8. Turn the knitting, make the double stitch by slipping the stitch from the left to the right needle, pull the yarn over the top and then knit back to the end of the row. I've completed the first half of my wedge, which was doing short rows but getting longer. I now want to come shorter again, so I'm going to knit the next row and I'm only working 16 stitches. So unlike the previous rows where I knitted up to the double stitch and then continued, this time I'm knitting a set number of stitches which doesn't take me up to the double stitch, and I'll have to deal with that later. But I've done my 16 stitches, so I'm going to turn the knitting, make a double stitch, so slip the stitch from left to right needle, and this time you can see I've got a light blue double stitch here because the stitch below is light blue. And then I need to work one more short row, but this time I'm only going to work 8 stitches. So that's my 8 stitches, but I still want a double stitch here. This is my double stitch from the previous group of 8, and then it's easier to see this double stitch. However, if you were making an item which was all in the same colour, you'd have to be able to recognise that that is the double stitch. So I'm going to turn the knitting again and make a new double stitch. So I've now done all the short rows to create my little wedge. So I had 3 short rows where I was getting longer, and then that middle row is the longest short row, and then I've become shorter again. So now I'm going back to using my dark colour So if I join in the darker blue again, I'm going to knit across all the stitches this time. So as I knit across, I'm going to be working the double stitches when I come to them. So I will be knitting 7 stitches, which will bring me up to the first double stitch. 2, 4, 6, 7. And this is my first double stitch, which is in the light blue, so you have to learn to recognise that that is a double stitch. Knit the 2 stitches together, and then I'm going to work to the next one, so there will be 7 stitches, normal stitches. And that brings me up to the double stitch again. So I knit the double stitch, and again I'm going to be knitting 7 more stitches, but this time, because this middle row was connected to the dark blue, I can see the double stitch more easily. So I've knitted the last light blue stitch. This is my double stitch, so I'm going to work that stitch and then carry on to the end of the row. Turn the knitting around and work a row over all stitches. So you can now clearly see that there are quite a few more rows at this end of my knitting than at this end of my knitting. I now have a knitted wedge shape within my piece of knitting. So that's knitting a wedge in a single colour, working longer short rows and then shorter short rows to get your wedge shape.